Hi, come on into the Bruce channel. I'm Bruce. And what is all this, you ask? Well, no one knows for sure, including me. It won't be a copy of anyone or anything, although my old morning show might serve as a model. And I readily credit any number of individuals. Hi, and indeed welcome. And that was a year ago, as we launched the Bruce channel. And this is our anniversary show. It's still an unknown, and we do tend to carom off things, but as the lady said, I never promised you a rose garden. But I did think it apropos to break out the anniversary threads. All right, so as you may have noticed, there was no episode of the Bruce channel last week. Actually, there was one, but it wasn't posted. My deadline, as often occurs, depending on where and when I have to be somewhere, was prior to Saturday, and also part of that equation is the time needed to render the video, the hours it takes to upload it, and then the processing hours at the host site. Anyway, in last week's episode, there were some strong words at times, and I tried to balance that with lots of haha, and then Paris happened. And even though it had been uploaded, I couldn't make myself click publish. The jokes just seemed a little too out of place with the wounds so very fresh. And like all previous moments of searing anguish, we've had them before, we will have them again. It isn't possible to forget. We don't forget. But were it not possible for our collective memories to heal a bit, no different than the death of a parent or a spouse, ultimately we'd all become catatonic. So, France, we'll get back to it in a bit. I should mention that were it not for last weekend's events, and thus postponing some of those things, today's show would likely have been a completely lighthearted walk down memory lane, because it was the Sunday before Thanksgiving that the Bruce channel launched. And to paraphrase Tennessee Ernie Ford, what do you get? Another year older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you take me, because I can't go. All right, so this is left over from last week, and it could be a lifesaver. And I wasn't aware of this previously, but apparently there's a new form of peanut butter being marketed. Actually, it may not be a new form, something I wasn't aware of, but it's advertised as having less sugar, and that's a good thing. But how did they do that? Artificial sweeteners. And like most artificial things, they're likely damaging. But here specifically, in peanut butter, one of the frequently used sweeteners is xylitol. And it's a bigger than normal deal because do you ever have a dog and sneak the pill in cheese or peanut butter? Or stuff a Kong toy for your dog with peanut butter? Xylitol is enormously toxic to dogs, much more so than chocolate. And everybody knows you don't give chocolate to a dog. Look at this graphic. As with any toxin, how much depends on the dose and the size of the host. But it takes a lot less xylitol than chocolate to kill a dog. So, read your labels. And if it doesn't specifically say xylitol, but it does say artificial sweeteners, stay the hell away from it. All right, Thanksgiving is coming, and the local paper ran an article last week about Black Friday. Essentially, its thrust was that Black Friday is waning in importance to retailers. The reasons are other days, both in advance of and after, are now getting as big a push, and of course online shopping reduces the need to awaken and stand in line at an obscene hour of the morning. Good news, too. There are only a few store chains opening on Thanksgiving. That's reversing a trend, a growing list of chains that refuse to. And if we'd simply boycott and not shop on Thanksgiving, they'd quit the practice entirely. Meanwhile, as far as I know, this is unprecedented. I love this. REI is a national outdoor and sporting goods chain, and they announced they'll be closed on Thanksgiving. And they're going to stay closed through Black Friday. Yeah, they're telling their employees, you matter. So enjoy the holiday and enjoy the day after the holiday, and we'll be fine. I thought that was kind of neat. Read holiday shopping. Yeah, I was in a store this week and had a sign, 30-some days till Christmas. Do they think we not know that? And then I remembered, a long time ago, that was a regular thing. Newspapers, store windows, they had been doing, except it seems a little meaningless now. In the old days, it was with a qualifier. Only 30-some shopping days left until Christmas. How quaint is that?
The legend lives on from the Chippewa down at the big lake they call Gitchagumi. The lake, it is said, never gives up for dead when the skies of November turn gloomy.
Yeah, that's, this was also from last week's show, because the ore boat, the Edmund Fitzgerald, went down in the cold waters of Gitchagumi, also occasionally known as Lake Superior, 40 years ago on November 10th specifically. So Gordon Lightfoot wrote and sang the song. There's now a museum, and it is one of those things that I think, similar to air crashes, makes us imagine what it must have been like. And although in worldwide consciousness it, as a maritime disaster, it probably is, well, certainly isn't as well known as the Titanic. It's maybe the second widely most thing. And if you don't know the song or the story, the song's on YouTube, and there are any number of places you can read about the Edmund Fitzgerald. And I read a good one right around the anniversary at cleveland.com. And it was a good story. I learned several things. Except there was a very annoying error. It was annoying because it was made by the author, and it was annoying because it was a grammar mistake. You know, if my mechanic told me this story, or my grocer, or even my veterinarian, or my veterinarian's cleaning person, if any of them had made the same error, it wouldn't be so annoying because, you know, grammar isn't part of the discipline. It's not part of the field of expertise, but a professional wordsmith ought to know the grammar. No? So, quote, in the 40 years since the mighty iron ore carrier sunk with all hands aboard. No, the boat didn't sunk. It sank. Sank is past tense. Sunk is past participle. So, it sank, or it had sunk, or it was sunk by the storm's enormous waves. Anyway, the error was then made repeatedly by a journalist. Otherwise, nice article. Which reminds me, as a kid, there were some job fantasies I had. Not career, just some jobs. And I, once upon a time, thought I'd like to work one summer on an ore boat. I was a goofy kid. So, in the last week here, we finally had a morning or two below freezing. For the most part, November has been warm. It was 73 3 days ago. But can anyone explain, warm or not, why my azalea is blooming? Even if being next to the house kept it from freezing, it is autumn. Maybe it's imported. Does it think we're from down under? Do you think I should tell it what's coming? Or that it's overdue? You know, I noticed a year ago in our promo for this first show, I said the temperature was 19.6 degrees. Wow, what a difference a year makes. Oh, and speaking of the weather, here we have now officially had another of those years with useless rain statistic. We've gotten a bit over 12 inches just since September 1st. Way over average. That might be the wettest or the second wettest ever for that time period. So what did that do? It took us from a drought condition officially labeled as exceptionally dry to one of a surplus. Yeah, so the year looked like we had a lot of water. And except for pumpkins, maybe, pretty useless for the growing season. I still have one mowing to do. Hey, let me tell you about my book, Shrink. Or wait, I can let others do it. So, did you watch the debates? There have been two. I admit I become a bit more frustrated as I watch them for a variety of reasons. On the Republican side, Chris Christie was dropped down to the undercard, and there he showed he can be pretty fast with his words and good on his feet. And he and Bobby Jindal faced off a few times. But undercard, who watched? Since then, though, just this week, Governor Jindal became the latest to drop out. On the Democratic side, as I've said, I'm displeased, but it is evolving from displeasure almost into disgust, not because of the candidates, but because, and I pointed this out before and others have, it looks like it's fixed. Big football night when they have the debate. That debate had the lowest ratings of any, even for the so-called undercards, which means Governor Martin O'Malley looked pretty good. But how many saw it? How many were listening and understood when Senator Sanders alluded to regime change? I will say this, I appreciated CBS not opening the event as though it were Mardi Gras or the Super Bowl. All the others have done that. I can't say. Maybe they toned it down because the night before was Paris. Or maybe they just have a better sense of propriety. I'm going to choose they have a better sense because it feels better to do it, that's all. By the way, of all the moderators in all the debates, I thought John Dickerson was the best. His questions were on point. He didn't ask silly things like, what color is your underwear, or stupid things. He followed up when appropriate, and he oozed professionalism. Maybe that's because it's in his blood. His mother was the pioneering and award-winning TV journalist, Nancy Dickerson. All right. I remain convinced. I admit, it's maybe beginning to seem more like an article of faith, as in the belief in something, the evidence of which is unseen. Nevertheless, I remain convinced that Donald Trump will not be the nominee. And sometimes, in fact, often, I despair for this country's future, but that despair is usually yet several decades in the future. Now, if Donald Trump were to become the Republican Party's nominee, then our failure, I think, would be much nearer at hand than I could ever have previously believed. Reading the different columns, and the pundits all said Ohio Governor John Kasich committed political suicide, and I think that's a bit overboard. He did get tripped up trying to explain how he'd handled the too-big-to-fail bank, and maybe that's what they remembered, but it wasn't all bad. By and large, not that much has changed, I think, in the standings, in my view, except, and yes, this was before the terrorist attacks in Paris, but honestly, how can anyone honestly, if they're giving it honest thought and not simple reflex, how can anyone believe that Mr. Trump, Dr. Carson, or Mrs. Fiorina have any business being president? Trump was once again bombastic, especially when asked about the TPP, the Pacific Trade Deal. And he came, oh, it's all that bad China stuff. China's going to do it again. They always do. They'll come in the back door. Pardon me, until Senator Rand Paul reminded that China isn't involved at all. It's got some things wrong with it, but the trade deal is designed to head off China gaining too much of an upper hand. Dr. Carson may be a nice man, and whether his personal story is exactly to the letter as described or not, that isn't the point. But in the recent debate and the ones before that, when he talks about foreign policy, honestly, he sounds incoherent. There are nouns and verbs and adjectives in his sentences, but they don't go anywhere. But that isn't terrifying. Terrifying, I reserve for Mrs. Fiorina. Honestly. I thought she might be channeling Sterling Hayden or George C. Scott in Dr. Strangelove. She was almost lustily speaking of, I don't mean lusting for President Vladimir Putin of Russia, but lustily saying, I'd start rebuilding the Sixth Fleet right under his nose, and the missile defense program in Poland right under his nose. And she went on to say she might put a few more thousand troops into Germany. That is terrifying. Putin may be an egomaniac, but he is not stupid. We have the most powerful military in the world, and he knows it. But she would wave a red cape at him. The closest the world has ever come to ending despite the various claims of rapture over the years, was in 1962. The Soviets put missiles into Cuba. We, the United States, formed a block. We called it a quarantine. Blockade legally is an act of war. And for nearly 2 weeks, the world held its breath. Now, despite calls for invasion by all the military chiefs, or Curtis LeMay wanted to bomb, surgical strikes, he could not guarantee that all the missiles would be taken out, and certainly some Russian personnel would have been killed. President Kennedy held out. He worked diplomacy. He worked back-channel diplomacy. And almost certainly we're all alive today because he resisted those calls. But here's the thing. Although adamant that the missiles had to go, he was also adamant that Premier Khrushchev be afforded a way out without losing face. So, Soviet missiles in Cuba, tantamount to our border, and we almost go to war. She wants to put missiles in Poland? If you were too young to remember much about the Cuban Missile Crisis, read up on it, or even just watch the movie The Missiles of October. It's a fairly accurate representation of what happened. Okay. Since the debate, of course, the attacks in Paris. Now that's going to amp up the heat from everyone, even Senator Paul, and he is the only one who understands, or at least gives voice to the understanding, that sending troops and boots on the ground is a whole lot different than shouting USA, USA at a Ryder Cup match, or even when Osama bin Laden's death was announced. Oh, USA! The world is intricate. It is overwhelmingly complex. And because we can destroy ourselves, and because of the speed with which we can do that, I want someone who can think through simplistic slogans. I want someone a lot smarter than I. Not someone I'm comfortable having a beer with, but someone who can compete well in three-dimensional chess. I think it was Senator Cruz who, speaking of the terrorists, said they hate us because of our values, because our women drive. That's not why they hate us. They hate us because we are in their lands. I saw this just this morning on Facebook. Would you fight if they were here? Of course. And that's how they feel. Because we have been there since World War I. So this isn't a new hate. It goes back decades and decades. We have propped up despotic regimes in any number of places in the world. The House of Saud in Saudi Arabia, Fulgencio Batista in Cuba, Reza Pahlavi in Iran, Perez Jimenez in Venezuela, and that's just to name a few. It's why, in 1958, then Vice President Richard Nixon, while riding in a car with his wife in Caracas, the capital of Venezuela, the car was overrun by a crowd, pushing and rocking the car, shouting, "Yankee, go home!" You don't have to take my word for any of this. Read Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins, or Sleeping with the Devil, another terrific book by former CIA operative Robert Baer. Now, I'm not saying any of this to make you angry, nor am I saying it to excuse the attackers. France has begun to hit back, and hard. And just weeks after Russia started to attack ISIS, ISIS brought down a Russian airliner. Russia's President Putin was seen meeting just this week with President Obama. So maybe what comes of all this is there is more cooperation between all of us, which then lets us better get to these religious zealots and take them out. They need to be taken out. But unless we understand what motivates them, everyone we kill will likely engender someone else, and maybe more than one, to take his place. And no amount of jingoism or drum beating or 1, I'll do this, 2, I'll do that, will change that. All right, my mother's favorite movie, or at least one of them, was Gone with the Wind. Now, back in her day, they weren't Blu-rays or DVDs or even VCRs. Gone with the Wind was the biggest grossing movie of all time because they re-release it every couple of years. And then every release, it would, again, make beaucoup bucks. And then finally, a big heralded event, finally it was going to be making its debut on television. I'd never seen it. Being a typically studly young, testosterone-poisoned young man, I couldn't fathom its appeal. So a number of years passed, 10, 15, more perhaps, and I'd since learned more of the lore. That Atlanta native Margaret Mitchell wrote it in 1936, think her only book. It became a phenomenon, the must-read of its day. And being the bestseller that it was, it had to be turned into a movie. And there was a legendary search for the female lead who would play Scarlett O'Hara. I learned of this, and then I discovered my mother actually had the book. I don't know, maybe I was bored one day, but I opened it and I was surprised. I remember years later being surprised by how much I enjoyed Harry Potter, and this was a lot like that. The antebellum images she conjured up, the mysteries and the plot twists and the page turning. Well, I discovered why it had been a runaway bestseller back then. All right, if you haven't read it, sure, give it a read. I'm not telling you this is Gone with the Wind, but I've just completed a book that I must say is very good. It's a very good read, and it's not a parallel, but it could be discussed in the same conversation as Gone with the Wind. It takes place just prior to the Civil War. It spans decades after that. It's called Ivy. Now, it's not a redo of the Southern plantation life. Instead, it's a look at life in a southern state, but in the mountains, the Appalachians, which is nothing at all like a cotton plantation. Okay, so it's a novel, but I'd call it faction. The main characters are real-life people. The author, Larry G. Morgan's great-great-grandparents. So there is a known history and then a probable history, and the story's tense, gripping, descriptions of battle, and of course the fear born within it. It's got twists and turns. Well, up to you. I've enjoyed it. Again, it's called Ivy by Larry G. Morgan. Finally this, in our inaugural episode last year, I derided with some humor, but nevertheless, the essence of, the publisher of the local paper, the Greensboro News and Record, wrote a letter. And I brought this up because a few weeks I received this nice letter from him, apprising me that the Thanksgiving paper would incur a surcharge of $2 because it was so laden with this extra advertising for Black Friday that it cost extra to produce, extra paper, extra ink, maybe extra to deliver. I said a year ago that I believe that this windfall of advertising might even ought to afford me a free paper, but certainly not cost extra. So prior to that initial episode, I had called him, left a message. He did not return my call. That's cool. I later called the paper that week, discovered there was no way to have the surcharge simply waived, so I opted to go on vacation that day. Well, I didn't receive a letter like that this year. Could it be that my rant last year might have found sympathy? Might its obvious validity have persuaded the brain trust? I called the paper. The nice customer service rep allowed that she knew of no such letter, but that this year's paper would cost $3, essentially repeating last year's policy. Gadzooks, I mean, this time, had I not been proactive, I might have been surprised with an extra $2 charge. Wait. She then allowed, exactly opposite of last year, that she could arrange for the paper to be delivered but without the extra charge. So, as was true last year, it's not the $2, it's the principle. And I'm going to take this as a small victory for truth, justice, and the American, well, for truth and justice anyway. All right, so despite the wailing and the gnashing of teeth, debating and the name-calling and the collective myopia, although we do have much wrong with us, we also have much right. So let's be grateful for what's right and strive to make better that which yet isn't. And may your week upcoming and the Thanksgiving Day contained within it be the best you've ever had.